My inheritance was $10, one bill in a small white envelope with my name on it in my mother's handwriting. My brother Gerald laughed so hard he had to take his glasses off and wipe his eyes. $10, he said. Even Mom knew, Walt. Even Mom. And then Mr. Hutchins, who had been my mother's lawyer for 40 years and who had not once looked up during the laughing, cleared his throat and said 5 words I will hear for the rest of my life. He said, "I'm not finished reading. I want to take you into that room, but first you should know what the laughing sounded like." Gerald's wife patted his arm and smiled at me the way you smile at a dog that's done something pitiful. My sister Linda looked at her lap, but I saw her shoulders shaking too. And I let them laugh. I'd like to tell you I said something sharp, something they'd remember. I didn't. I picked up the envelope, and I felt something stiff inside it, and my heart did a strange thing in my chest, though I couldn't have told you why just yet. So pour yourself something warm and settle in, because this is a long story and it doesn't start in that office. It starts 58 years earlier, at a kitchen table with a hailstorm and a coffee can and a boy who wanted a baseball glove. My name is Walter. I'm 69 years old. I carried the mail on the same rural route for 34 years. And this is a story about the difference between what a thing costs and what it's worth. My folks farmed 240 acres of corn and beans on Bidwell Road, in the kind of township where the roads are named for whoever lived at the end of them 100 years ago. The house was white clapboard with a porch across the front, and my mother, Ruth, kept a garden that people slowed their cars to look at. My father, Emmett, was a quiet man with forearms like fence posts, and he believed 2 things with his whole heart: that land answers honest work, and that you never buy anything you can't pay for twice. There were 3 of us. Gerald came first in '53 and he was born selling. By 10 he was trading pocket knives at school for better pocket knives. My folks used to joke that Gerald could sell a bucket of smoke and he'd grin, but I want you to notice something about that joke because I noticed it early. Gerald never thought it was a joke. He thought it was a scouting report. I came along in '57, and Linda came in '60, the baby, pretty as a calendar picture, and she learned young that the easiest place to stand in our family was wherever Gerald was pointing. I don't say that to be unkind. My sister spent most of her life as a passenger in other people's cars, if you take my meaning, and there are worse sins. But it matters to this story. We weren't poor, but we were the kind of family where money was weather. You watched it. You talked about it at supper the way you talked about clouds coming up from the southwest. A good year meant new boots in the fall. A bad year meant my mother at the kitchen table on Sunday nights with the checkbook and a tablet of paper, doing the arithmetic in her small, straight handwriting, moving numbers around like furniture that never quite fit the room. Which brings me to the summer of 1968, when I was 11 years old. That spring I had decided, with the seriousness that only an 11-year-old can bring to anything, that I was going to buy myself a Rawlings baseball glove. Not a hand-me-down. Not Gerald's old one with the pocket worn slick and his initials in ink on the strap. Mine. It cost $11 and change at the hardware store in town, and Mr. Pfeiffer, who ran the store, had agreed to hold it for me behind the counter, and all summer I pushed our old reel mower around every lawn within biking distance. Widow ladies' yards, the church lot, the Hendersons' double lot with the ditch that liked to eat a mower blade. Quarter here, 50 cents there. I kept it all in a Folgers can under my bed, and some nights I'd take it out and count it even though I knew to the nickel what was in there. By the second week of August I had $10, and I can still feel what that $10 felt like. Heavy. Some money is heavier than other money. I've handled a fair amount of both kinds since, and I've never stopped being able to tell the difference. Then came the 22nd of August. I know the date because the whole county knows the date. The sky went green about 4 in the afternoon, and the hail came through like judgment, and in 20 minutes the corn that was going to pay the bank note and the seed bill, and everything else was lying flat in the fields like somebody had walked the rows with a scythe. My father stood at the window and watched it happen and didn't say one word. That was the frightening part. My father was quiet the way a pond is quiet, but this was different. This was quiet like a barn with the doors open and nothing in it. 2 nights later I woke up thirsty and came halfway down the stairs, and I stopped, because my parents were at the kitchen table and the tablet of paper was out. I sat down on a stair in the dark and listened to my mother's pencil and my father's silence. The numbers weren't furniture that night. They were a wall, and I heard my mother set the pencil down and say, quietly, "Emmett, the electric is due Friday and I don't have it. It'll have to wait on the insurance man, and the insurance man is going to be a while." And my father said the only thing I ever heard him say that scared me. He said, "Ruthie, I don't know what to do." I went back up the stairs. I sat on my bed for a long time with the Folgers can in my lap, and I'm going to be honest with you, because a story like this is worthless if you polish the boy up into a little saint. I sat there and I argued with myself. I thought about that glove behind Mr. Pfeiffer's counter with the tag on it waiting. I thought, it's not my job, I'm 11. I thought Gerald's 15. He's got money from trading, let him. I thought all of it. And then I thought about my father saying I don't know what to do in that flat, empty voice. And I found out something about myself that I've been finding out ever since, which is that I cannot sit warm in bed while somebody I love is sitting in a cold kitchen with a wall of numbers. I came down in my pajamas and I put the $10 bill on the table in front of my mother. It was 10 ones worth of quarters and dimes traded up at the bank into one bill, because a bill felt more like a man's money to me. And I said, "I've been saving it, and I don't need a glove." My mother looked at that bill, and then she looked at me, and her face did something complicated that I was too young to read then and have spent 58 years learning to read since. She did not say, "Oh, honey, I can't take this." I've thanked her my whole life for that. She knew what it cost, and she knew that turning it down would teach me the wrong lesson about what I was worth. She smoothed that bill flat on the table with 2 fingers twice, like she was petting it, and she said, "Walter Dawes, this is a loan. Do you hear me? A loan. And someday I am going to pay you back with interest." Then she got up and kissed the top of my head and told me to get to bed. And at the door I looked back and saw her still sitting there with her hand flat on that $10 bill, and my father looking at her, and neither one of them saying anything at all. The electric stayed on. The insurance man came through in October short, the way insurance men do, but the bank carried us and the farm survived, the way farms did back then, by inches. Nobody ever spoke of that night again. I never got the glove, if you're wondering. By the next summer I'd grown into Gerald's old one anyway, and I played third base with his initials on my hand all through school, and if I'm honest that stung a little every game, and I never once said so. And here is the detail that matters, so hold on to it. I never knew what became of that bill. I assumed it went to the electric company with the rest. It would be 58 years before I found out different. Life moved along the way it does. Gerald graduated and went off to sell cars in the city, and it turned out cars were the pocket knives he'd been practicing for. By 30, he had his own lot. By 40, he had 3 with his name up on lighted signs, Gerald Dawes Automotive Group, and a house with pillars out front that didn't hold anything up, and Candace, who matched the house. Linda married a fellow named Roy who did something with insurance that I never fully understood and don't believe Linda did either. And they landed in a subdivision on the good side of the city and joined the club Gerald belonged to. And from then on, whichever way Gerald was facing, that was the direction my sister faced too. And I stayed. I want to be square with you about this, because Gerald spent 40 years telling the story like I stayed because I couldn't do anything else, and there were years, I'll admit, when I half believed him. I stayed because I liked it here. I liked the flat land and the big sky and knowing everybody's dog by name. I took the exam and got on with the postal service in '78, and I drew the rural route that ran right past our own farm. And for 34 years I drove that loop, 100 and some miles of gravel and blacktop, mailboxes leaning like old men, and I knew every family on it, who was sick, who was selling, whose boy made the paper for wrestling. I married Carol in '81, and if this story has a hero in it anywhere, she's it, but I'll get to that. We raised 2 kids in a brick house in town, 4 square rooms and a porch, paid for twice, like my father taught me. Dad died in '79. His heart quit on him in the East Field on a bright cold morning in March. He was 54, and everybody, and I mean everybody, assumed my mother would sell. The equipment dealer assumed it. The neighbors assumed it. Gerald drove out from the city in a new Oldsmobile and sat at the kitchen table, 26 years old with a salesman's haircut, and explained to his mother patiently, like she was slow, what the land would bring and what she could do with the money, safe in the bank, drawing interest. My mother heard him all the way out. She was always polite that way. Then she said, "Gerald, your father is in this dirt now, and I'll not be handing him to strangers." And she rented the fields on shares to the Kowalski boys down the road, kept the books herself in that same straight handwriting, and ran that farm off a kitchen table for the next 40-odd years. People called it stubbornness. I drove past those fields 6 days a week with the mail, and I'd see her out walking the lane in her coat, checking the beans like Dad used to, and I never called it stubbornness. I called it what it was: faithfulness. Now I have to walk you through the middle years quicker than they deserve, because it's the pattern that matters, and the pattern was this. Gerald came home twice a year, Thanksgiving and sometime in the summer, arriving late and leaving early, and every visit he appraised. He couldn't help it, I think, any more than a woodpecker can help hammering. He'd walk into the farmhouse and you could watch his eyes go over everything: the walnut sideboard, the acreage out the window, the new roof on the machine shed, tallying. He'd stand on the porch with his coffee looking at land his father was buried in and say things like, "You know what the Mayer place brought at auction?" And my mother would say, "I heard," and he'd say, "Per acre, Mom. Per acre." And she'd say, "More coffee, Gerald." And Linda called on Sundays and came when it suited and was pleasant and took her cues. If Gerald said the farm was too much for Mom, Linda worried aloud about the farm being too much for Mom. If Gerald said the stairs were dangerous, Linda mentioned the stairs. My sister is not a schemer. I want that understood. She's a weather vane, and for most of her life the wind blew from Gerald. And me, I was around. That's the whole of it. I was around the way a fence is around. I fixed what broke. I plowed her lane in winter before my route and changed her furnace filters and drove her to Columbus when her eyes needed the specialist. Carol did her hair every other Saturday, and our kids did their homework at that kitchen table 1,000 afternoons. None of it was sacrifice. I'd have paid admission. That woman was better company at 85 than most people are at 30. She read 3 newspapers, kept a bird book by the window with a pencil in it, and could still take you apart at gin rummy while telling you about a hired man from 1952. I'll give you one afternoon out of hundreds so you can see her plain. Her 89th birthday. Carol baked the cake and Mom won 4 hands of rummy in a row, and I accused her, half serious, of marking the deck. And she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Walter, I have been counting things my whole life. Eggs, bushels, dollars, children. You think I can't count 52 cards?" Then she laid down her hand, gin, naturally, and while I was shuffling she looked out the window at the bird feeder and said, "The thing about counting is, most people only count what's in front of them. The good bookkeepers count what's missing." I wrote it off as birthday philosophy. You'll see in a while why I never will again. But I learned something in those years about how a family divides up the roles, and how the one who stays gets valued like the water in the well. Which is to say, not at all, until it isn't there. At the holidays, Gerald would hold court about margins and inventory floors, and Roy would nod along about liability umbrellas. And if I mentioned anything from my life, the route, the town, a storm that took the Henderson silo, there'd be that pause, that little polite pause you'd give a child who interrupted, and then the conversation would close back over it like water over a stone. One Thanksgiving, and I never told my mother this, I came back inside from the truck and heard Gerald in the kitchen saying to Roy, "Well, Walt's the one with time on his hands. No offense to him, but when you deliver mail for a living, your afternoons are your own." And Roy chuckled, and I stood in the mudroom with my hand on the door and did not go in, and that sentence sat in my chest for 20 years. No offense to him. In my experience, no sentence that starts that way has ever once finished honest. When I retired off the route in 2012, the town put on a little do at the fire hall, cake and coffee and a plaque, and half the county came, because 34 years of knowing everybody adds up whether you mean it to or not. Mom sat in the front row in her good coat. Gerald made it for the last 20 minutes, checked his phone through most of them, and on his way out he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, Walt, enjoy the pension. Must be nice being done at 55. And Mom, who missed nothing, watched the door close behind him and said quietly, to nobody in particular, "That boy has never once been done with anything in his life." It took me years to understand she didn't mean it as a compliment. The last decade is where this story earns its keep, so I'll slow back down. Mom made it to her late 80s in better shape than anybody had a right to, and then time started collecting, the way it does, a little at a time. The eyes first, then the hip, then the winter she got pneumonia and scared us all, and after that she was smaller, you know how they get smaller, and the farmhouse got bigger around her in proportion. I was retired off the route by then, so I just folded her into my days. Coffee with her most mornings at 10. Pills in the organizer Sunday nights. Her crossword started so she could finish it, because she said starting was the boring part. I did her banking in town and her taxes at her kitchen table every February, and she'd sit across from me supervising like I might pocket the stamps. There was a winter, 3 years back, when the power went out in an ice storm and I couldn't raise her on the phone, and I drove Bidwell Road at 15 miles an hour with my heart in my mouth, and found her wrapped in your father's old barn coat. She called it that, your father's, 45 years on, reading her bird book by a kerosene lamp like it was 1948. I stayed the night on the daybed. And somewhere past midnight in the dark, her voice came down the hall wide awake. "Walter, did you eat?" 90 years old, icicles on the wires, and her one concern was whether the child in the house had eaten. I said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "There's ham in the icebox." Then, a minute later, almost to herself, she said, "You always were the one who ate what was put in front of him and said thank you." I didn't know it then, but I've come to believe the estate was settled that night or nights like it. Not in the lawyer's office. In the dark over ham. And the more she needed, the more often Gerald's Buick was in the lane. You'd think that would have warmed me. It did not, because I'd known Gerald 60 years, and Gerald did not drive 2 hours for coffee. He drove 2 hours for closings. It started gentle. Brochures left on the table, sunny pictures of a place called Brookdale Commons, seniors laughing over card games, the word maintenance-free doing a lot of work. Then it was, "Mom, this house is a liability. One fall on those stairs and everything you and Dad built goes to a nursing home and the government." Then it was a lawyer friend of his who did, quote, family planning, and wouldn't it be simpler if Gerald had power of attorney, streamline things, one signature, no burden on anybody. I sat in on that one at Mom's asking. I watched my brother slide a folder across her own kitchen table the way he'd slide paper across a desk at the dealership, here, here, and here, and I watched my mother not touch it. She let it lie there. She said, "I'll read it over, Gerald," which I came to understand was her way of saying no with the least possible gunpowder. And the pressure didn't let up, it changed shapes. The Thanksgiving before she died, he brought a man with him, introduced him as a friend who, quote, knows land. And this fellow, this friend, walked my mother's fence line before dinner with his phone out, taking pictures, and at her own table, over her own turkey, he told the room what 240 acres of prime tillable was bringing at auction, per acre, and Gerald sat back and watched her face the way he'd watch a customer hearing the monthly payment, waiting for the flinch. My mother, 90 years old, wiped her mouth with her napkin, set it down, and said, "And I will remember this until they close the lid on me." She said, "Mr. Prentice, you'll want more beans there from my garden." And that was every bit of the answer that fellow ever got. But driving home that night, Carol said something in the dark of the truck that I chewed on for weeks. She said, "Walter, your mother is winning every battle, but she's 90. And someday, and it'll be a Tuesday like any other, the battles will be Gerald's and Linda's and yours. And Gerald has never once in his life walked away from money on a table. You ought to think about that." I did think about it. I want to be honest with you tonight, because the man in this story is not a saint either, any more than the boy was. I lay awake some nights doing arithmetic I was ashamed of. 240 acres, split 3 ways after lawyers took their taste, what that would mean for our retirement, for our kids. And other nights I lay awake certain that Gerald would find a way to shade it his direction, because all my life I'd watched him shade things his direction, and I'd rehearse arguments in the dark, whole courtroom speeches, until Carol would roll over and say, "You're grinding your teeth again. You want to know what betrayal does before it ever gets around to happening. It costs you your sleep years in advance. It's the only debt I know that charges interest before you've borrowed a thing." The one thing I never did, and I say this with my hand flat on the table, is talk to my mother about her will. Not once. Not a hint, not a joke, not a fish around the edges of it. Partly that was pride, I won't pretend otherwise. But mostly it was this. Every Sunday I watched Gerald and Linda, each in their own key, audition for that will. And I decided somewhere along the line that whatever my mother chose to do with her own life's work, she was going to get to choose it with one child who never once put a thumb on the scale. That was worth more to me than the acres. Most days. Now, about 10 months before the end, there was an evening I didn't understand at the time, and understand completely now. I'd fixed the latch on her storm door and we were having coffee, and she wasn't at the table. She was standing at the counter with her old Betty Crocker cookbook open, the red and white one, so swollen with 50 years of clipped recipes it had a rubber band around it to keep its figure. And she was looking at something pressed inside the back cover, not cooking anything, just looking. And she said, without turning around, "Walter, do you remember the hailstorm? 68. I said, "I remember it took the corn." She said, "It took more than the corn." And then she said, in a voice I'd never quite heard from her, "Do you know what I'd have said that summer if the Lord had told me which one of my children would be standing in this kitchen with me at the end? I'd have guessed wrong." She closed the book and put the rubber band back around it and said, "Isn't that something? I'd have guessed wrong." And then she asked about Carol's tomatoes like nothing had happened, and I drove home thinking she was getting sentimental, the way they do. She wasn't sentimental. She was doing her books. She was a farm wife at a kitchen table, moving the last of the furniture into the room where it fit, and I didn't see it. She died the last week of April. In her sleep, in her own bed, in the house my father paid for twice, with her crossword half finished on the nightstand, and I will tell you what I told Carol at the funeral home. We should all close our accounts so clean. At the funeral, Gerald cried, and I'll give him this, I believe those tears. It's a strange, true thing about people, that a man can spend 10 years circling his mother's land like a gull and still be her little boy in the front pew. Both things live in the same heart. I've quit trying to explain it. Linda held my hand at the graveside, and for one afternoon we were just 3 gray-haired kids who used to ride one bicycle down Bidwell Road, and I thought, Maybe this is what finally settles us. That lasted 4 days. On the fifth day, I drove out to check the furnace, and Candace's SUV was in the lane, and inside I found little colored stickers on the furniture, on the walnut sideboard, on the grandfather clock, on the china hutch, a pink sticker like the house was a rummage sale. Candace explained, smooth as lotion, that they were just getting organized, that Gerald had read somewhere it prevents disputes, and honest to Pete she had a notebook with columns. My mother was 11 days in the ground. I took the sticker off the sideboard, put it in my pocket, and left, because the alternative was saying something my father wouldn't have approved of in his house. But I did take one thing out of that house that day, and I wanted on the record that I didn't know what I was carrying. On the kitchen counter, in a cardboard box Candace had labeled in marker "Donate," sat my mother's Betty Crocker cookbook, the red and white one, rubber band and all. Donate. 50 years of her handwriting in the margins, gravy stains from 3 different decades, and it was headed for a church basement sale table at 50 cents. I took it. I didn't ask. I set it on the seat of my truck like a passenger and drove it home, and Carol cleared a place for it on our counter, and neither of us knew what that book had been carrying for 58 years, or how close its cargo came to a 50-cent table. Though as it turned out, my mother had already moved the cargo somewhere safer. She'd thought of everything. She always did. But once in a while, I still wake up at night over that box marked "Donate." That Friday, Mr. Hutchins' office called. The will would be read Tuesday, 10 o'clock. And knowing what you know now, which is everything I knew then, I want you to sit where I sat that Tuesday, in the second-floor office over the old savings and loan, oak table, radiator ticking. Gerald in a suit that cost more than my truck. Candace with the notebook, Linda and Roy, and me and Carol and Mr. Hutchins, 82 years old, opening a folder with hands like paper and no hurry in him at all. The small bequests came first. 5,000 apiece to each grandchild for a start in life, is what the will said. 10,000 to the church for the roof and the food pantry, and I saw Candace write that down. Her bird books and binoculars to the county library where she'd taught summer reading 40 years back. Dad's pocket watch to Gerald. Her mother's cameo to Linda. Small, straight handwriting things, each one landing soft, and the room stayed polite. Then Mr. Hutchins said, to my son Gerald, I leave $40,000. To my daughter Linda, I leave $40,000. And I watched my brother do his arithmetic. It was fast, he's always been fast. 40,000 out of an estate with 240 acres in it is not a share, it's a tip. And his eyes came up off the table and went narrow, and then Mr. Hutchins said, and to my son Walter, I leave the enclosed envelope and the sum of $10. And there it was. The envelope came across the oak, my name on it in her hand and something stiff inside. And Gerald, the relief coming off him like heat off a July road, because if I got $10 then the shares he was fearing weren't happening and the land was still in play. Gerald laughed, and laughed, took his glasses off. Even Mom knew, Walt, even Mom. Candace patted his arm, smiling at me. Linda's shoulders going. Roy studying the ceiling with his lips pressed together like a man holding a sneeze. My wife's hand closed over my knee under that table hard enough to leave a mark, and Carol will tell you to this day she wasn't steadying me. She was anchoring herself. And I sat there with 58 years of no offense to him ringing in my ears, and I picked up the envelope, and I felt the shape of what was inside it, and I still, so help me, did not understand. Then Mr. Hutchins cleared his throat and said he wasn't finished reading, and the room settled, and he looked at Gerald just a beat longer than he needed to, and he read the next paragraph. The remainder of my estate, the will said. The farm, the house, all 240 acres, the accounts, and the residue entire, I direct as follows. And here Mr. Hutchins paused and explained, in that dry voice lawyers save for the sentences they've been waiting years to say, that there was in fact very little estate remaining to direct, Because in March of 2019, 7 years prior, Ruth Dawes had placed the farm, the house, and the bulk of her holdings into a living trust, the Ruth Dawes Family Trust. Executed in that very office, notarized, witnessed, with a physician's letter of sound mind attached, because, and I quote Mr. Hutchins quoting my mother, she said her eldest had a good lawyer and she intended to make him useless. Sole successor trustee and sole beneficiary of that trust, Walter Emmett Dawes. I don't remember the next several seconds honestly, so I won't invent them for you. I remember Candace's pen stopped. I remember Gerald saying, "That's not," and then stopping, because there was no end to that sentence that helped him. And I remember Linda looking at me, first out of everybody, my weather-vane sister, swinging around at last, and what was on her face wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was recognition. And then Mr. Hutchins said, "There's a letter." She asked that it be read aloud to all of you. And he unfolded 2 pages of that small, straight handwriting, the handwriting from the tablet at the kitchen table in 1968. And he read my mother's last words to her children, and I'm going to give them to you now the best I can, because I've read that letter more times than I've read anything but scripture. To my 3 children it said, "If Arthur is reading this, then I'm with your father, and the first thing I want said is that I loved each one of you your whole lives, and I want that heard before the rest, because the rest is bookkeeping, and love is not bookkeeping. But bookkeeping matters too. Your father and I never once in 50 years spent a dollar we hadn't looked at twice, and I'll not change my ways at the end. Gerald, you told me once, standing on my porch, that farmland is just money that hasn't been collected yet. You've been collecting your whole life, son, and I've watched what it's made of you, and a mother is allowed to say this once and from the grave. You have 3 lots full of cars, and I never once heard you speak of any of it the way your father spoke of the East Field after rain. I am leaving you money because money is the language you chose, and I'm speaking it to you one last time so you'll know you were heard. Spend it or bank it, it's yours free and clear. But the land was never money, and so it was never yours. Your father is in that dirt. Linda, my girl, you have spent your life certain that the safest place to stand was next to whoever seemed strongest, and I'm telling you now, it cost you your own 2 feet, and it cost you and me 100 Sundays we'll not get back. The money comes to you with no strings and one wish, that you'd spend some of it going somewhere Roy and Gerald aren't, and find out what Linda thinks about something. I'd have liked to have met her. Tell her hello from her mother. And Walter. And here Carol says, Mr. Hutchins' voice changed, though I couldn't tell you myself, because the room had gone away by then and there was just the handwriting. Walter, it said, open the envelope. And I did. And inside, in a fold of wax paper pressed flat as the day she smoothed it on that kitchen table with 2 fingers, was a $10 bill, Series 1963, and along the white edge of it in faded pencil in a woman's small straight hand was written, W.D. August 1968, alone. 58 years. It never went to the electric company. She'd paid that bill some other way, borrowed or scraped or gone without. I'll never know because she never said. She kept the bill. It rode inside the back cover of a Betty Crocker cookbook through Nixon and the farm crisis, and the flood of 97 and 32 harvests and my father's funeral, and every Thanksgiving Gerald ever priced her land at her own table. Pinned there like a note, a woman writes to make sure she never forgets what she owes and to who. The letter had 1 paragraph left. They will tell you, Walter, the letter said, that $10 is an insult. Let them. You and I know what it is. It is the only debt I ever carried that I was proud of, and I have had 58 years to think about the interest. Interest is what grows on top of what was planted, and what you planted at my kitchen table when you were 11 years old, you have been planting every day since, and never once asked after the harvest. So here is your principal returned, son, and the farm is the interest. The math comes out fair. I did it at the kitchen table the way I do all my books, and I checked it twice, and your father checked it too, the night before I signed the trust. Don't you dare frame this bill. It spends. Buy your glove, Walter. Love, Mom. Buy your glove. 90 years old, and she remembered the glove. I had never told a living soul about that glove but Carol. I don't cry easy. Root men learn not to. You'd be surprised what you deliver over 34 years, and what doors you have to stand at after. But I sat in that lawyer's office over the savings and loan with a $10 bill in a fold of wax paper, and I put my hand over my eyes, and my wife held onto my arm with both hands, and I cried like the furnace had gone out inside me. And here's the thing I want you to sit with. It wasn't the farm. God's honest truth, in that minute the farm was a rumor from another county. It was the bill. It was finding out that the smallest thing I ever did, the thing I'd half forgotten and never once traded on, had been riding in the back of a cookbook for 58 years, itemized, remembered, kept. We spend our whole lives, all of us, wondering whether the quiet things got seen. They got seen. Somebody at some kitchen table is keeping books you know nothing about, and the entries are honest, and nothing you plant in good faith is ever lost. I know that now for a fact. It cost my mother her whole life to teach it to me, and I'm handing it to you tonight for nothing, because that's how she'd want it spent. Carol drove us home from the lawyer's office. I carried the envelope in both hands the whole way, like a man carrying water in a drought, and neither of us spoke until the truck was in our own driveway. Then my wife shut off the engine and sat there, and finally she said, "Walter, I have been married to you for 45 years, and I knew about the glove, and I never knew about the $10. And I said nobody did. That was sort of the point of it. And Carol looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, honey. The point of it was that somebody did. She's been right for 45 years. No sense in her stopping now." That evening I drove out to the farm alone, let myself in the kitchen door with my own key, and sat down at that table, her chair still pushed in where she left it, and I laid the bill on the wood, flat, where it had lain in 1968. The house was quiet the way a church is quiet on a weekday. I'm not a man who hears voices, friend, and I heard nothing that evening either. But I'll tell you what I did do. I said thank you out loud to an empty kitchen 58 years late, and then I turned on her porch light and went home. Now I owe you the rest, because a story is a debt too, and I pay mine. Gerald contested. Of course he did, or rather he sent a letter through his lawyer friend, undue influence, diminished capacity, the standard hymnal. It lasted exactly one meeting. Mr. Hutchins laid out the trust, 7 years old, drawn while she was beating the whole county at gin rummy. The physician's letter. The two witnesses, one of whom was Gerald's own high school principal, 91 and sharp as tin snips and delighted to testify. And then Hutchins slid one more paper across, my mother's foresight again, a no-contest clause on the 40,000. Challenge and lose, and the 40 went to the church roof. My brother did his arithmetic. It was fast. He's always been fast. That was the end of the matter, and I have not laid eyes on him since the day the check cleared, and it grieves me more than I expected, and I do nothing different, and both of those are true at once, which is about how family works, near as I can tell. Candace sent for the walnut sideboard through a shipping company. I sent the sideboard, freight paid. I also went through the house first and took the stickers off, every last one, and I burned them in the burn barrel, and I'm not the least bit sorry to report that it was satisfying. Linda now. Linda I want to tell you about, because my mother's letter turned out to be seed too, not just settlement. My sister didn't speak in that office, and she didn't call for a month, and when she finally came, she came alone, no Roy, driving her own car the whole 2 hours, which Carol pointed out was maybe the first time in 40 years my sister had crossed the county line without an escort. She stood on the farmhouse porch where I was painting the rail, and she held out her cameo, our grandmother's, and she said, "This should stay in the house," and then she cried, and what she said through it was, "I laughed, Walter, in the office. I laughed with them. I've been hearing myself do it every night since." And I said, "I know, I heard you too." And then I said, "Mom left me the coffee, come in and have some. Because here's the thing about a weather vane. You can't hold the years of wind against it. You can only be glad when it finally swings around to true. She comes most months now. Took herself to Ireland in the fall alone, sent me a postcard of green hills that said, 'Linda thinks it's beautiful here.' Mom would have caught the joke. I keep it in the bird book by the window. The farm, you'll want to know. The Kowalski boys' grandson farms it now on the same handshake shares his grandfather had. A young fellow with a good wife and dirt on his cap. And the first thing he asked me was whether he could fix up the garden beds for his own kids, and I had to walk to the barn on account of something in my eye. Carol and I never moved in. Our brick house in town is paid for twice and fits us like old boots, but I'm out there most days. I keep the lane plowed and the latch fixed and the porch painted, and her garden's gone to my granddaughter, who plants it every May and calls it Great-Grandma Ruth's dirt, which it is. And the bill. She said don't frame it, and I minded her mostly. It lives where it lived, pressed in the back of the Betty Crocker with the rubber band around it, on my kitchen counter now, and every February I take it out while I do the taxes, just to hold the weight of it. Some money is heavier than other money. I told you that at the start. But I did spend a little of the interest. First week I had the checkbook for that trust. I drove into town to the hardware, which is a Pfeiffer grandkid running it still, and I bought a Rawlings glove, top of the line, and I gave it to my grandson, who plays third base like his great uncle Gerald never knew I could. And when he asked what he owed me for it, I told him, plant something quiet for somebody someday and we're square. So that's the story. If you take one thing from an old mail carrier, take this. In every family there's somebody keeping the real books, and it's almost never the one doing the loud arithmetic at Thanksgiving. Be careful what you laugh at in a lawyer's office. The smallest bequest in the room may be the one that was 58 years compounding. And if you've got somebody quiet in your family, the one who stays, the one who fixes the latch and plows the lane and never asks after the harvest, don't wait for a will to tell you what they're worth. Tell them Sunday. Kitchen tables hear more than churches, and it's cheaper to say it over coffee than to write it in a trust. It's evening here now. Carol's got the radio on low and the Betty Crocker's on the counter with its rubber band, keeping its figure and its secrets. The beans came in good this year, the young fellow tells me. She'd have wanted to know that. And the porch light's on. It always is. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, stay a while. There's a new one on this porch every week, and the light's on for you too. This has been the Porch Light. This story, like all stories told here, is an original work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental. Good night, friend. Drive safe going home.